And we are live, I guess. Right? Let's see. Oh yeah, I'm live. There you go. Cool. Is there streaming? Does the stream remains after you finish? I guess. I guess it does. Okay. So this is today's class. Last class, I remember the last thing that we learned was about React query, and usually what we have for this class is just the context and flux, right? So in the lesson you will see something like flux and context. Oh. Okay. Now we can discuss what flux is, and of course we're going to see context because context is something that comes out of the box with React, so we need to understand what a context is and how to use it. And actually we have a lot of contexts that we're already using. You remember in last class when we were using React query, we were putting a provider, right? And everything in our app was inside a provider. So that technically is a context. And flux was a term, I think it was invented like probably 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. And it was basically the way data flows in a React application to simplify how can we reason about this data, right? And usually what we have is something like this. We have some data store, right? And this data store will define how we render that information, right? This is known. This is basically how React works. So we have some data, and from that data we render the visual representation of the data, right? Now, in a Flux implementation, what you have next is something that we call actions. So actions. So everything that happens after you render that page is an action. It's a function that you can call, and that function is the one that can modify the data store, right? Now, if you can see, this is a circular flow, right? You go from data to rendering, and from rendering, the only thing that you can do is call an action, and that action will modify the data store. And then a new render will show up, and then you have that flow of data, right? And data only flows in that direction. You modify the data, a render is made, and then whatever action you need to do, you have to call an action, right? So actions are the only ones that modify data. And this is smart because you don't modify data from the component itself, right? So this simplify a lot of applications, and this is what we call flux. Now, this is not deprecated or obsolete. We still use this in a different way. It's just that when this was created, there were a lot of libraries like Redux, and you probably heard about this. You've probably seen this name around associated with React. So Redux, and more currently Redux Toolkit, is a library that implemented very well this design, right? This circular design. There was all the libraries that implemented the same, but for some reason Redux was the most popular, and a lot of companies use it for a long time. Now today, I'm not sure that how many companies still use Redux or the new version Redux Toolkit. But what we keep is the essence of Flux, right? data flowing in a single direction. Now, if you remember the app that we built in last class, the to-do list app, the same component was modifying the state, right? Because we have a store with all the to-dos, and then every time we added a new to-do, we directly in that component we add it to the store, or we send it to the backend. And if we delete it, then we send the delete to the backend. So the component was doing these data modifications. And this is not wrong per se, because it works for certain applications. It works, but if you're building an application, a large scale application, then it becomes a little bit problematic, because you have to maintain all that code, right? It becomes harder to maintain. So in that sense, we have newer libraries that try to implement the same behavior in a simpler way. Today we're going to see one of these libraries is Zustand, right? So Zustand is a library that allows us to create custom hooks. Remember, hooks are these functions that we can use only inside a React component, and they give us some behavior, right? So far we learned several hooks that come native with React, like use state, use effect. What's the other hook that we learned so far? I don't think, that's pretty much it, right? Only these two. Well, there is other hooks that come directly with React, like use reducer, use memo, use callback, and the one that we're going to learn today, use context. Okay. Now these three, like honestly, I never used this before. It's a concept that comes from Redux actually. So Redux, the library, have the concept of a reducer. A reducer is just a function that has the previous state and the action that you want to implement with the data, and that reducer is basically modifying the state to the new state, right? So that's what we call a reducer. It's just a function that goes from one state to the next state, right? Now, I never used this in a real life application before. I don't think many people use it. It's fine. Now, these two, I use it a lot. These are memoization functions, these two. Memoization means if I had to call a function one time, it's no big deal, right? But if I had to call that function 1,000,000 times, and that function, every time I render the page, changes, that's a lot of memory, and that's a lot of overhead, right? And that's when you want to use something like use callback. So use callback is used to memoize handlers. We've seen it in React components that we have these handlers. Handlers are the functions that you call when you click a button, when you submit a form, when you do some interactivity. Those are handlers, right? The on click, on change, those are handlers. If you're calling the same handler 1,000,000 times, you want to use, well, it doesn't have to be 1,000,000 times, by the way. If you have like a very big form and you have a single handler that controls all the forms, you might want to use a callback, because then that function doesn't change between renderings, and it's actually faster, right? Because it doesn't have to create a new function every time. So we use callback for that. And use memo is used when you have some data, right, that has to be derived from all the data. So you have, like, let's say you have a big table, and from that big table you have to get the minimum, the maximum, and the average, right? And you're always showing that at the bottom of your table. If you have to calculate the average every time you are rendering the page, that's a lot of overhead. So what you do is you just calculate the average one time, and you put it in the page. And if the data changes, then you recalculate the average. Only if the data changes, right? So that's what use memo does. It's just calculating data when the calculation is kind of large. So those two hooks also come with React. We never used it before, but that's the use. And this one is the one that we're going to learn today, useContext. But we're going to learn it, but not going to use it because this is kind of like something that exists, but it's not often that you have to create a context by yourself. Usually a third-party library will create the context for you. For example, we have context. We have context for authentication. So some libraries that provide authentication will have context for that. There is libraries, for example, for SDKs. We're going to use one in next week. We're going to use the SDK for Supabase. So the SDK, the Supabase SDK provides also a context. And we use like providers in general, like the one from React Query, right? So these are examples of context. Usually we get a library, we install a library, and that library provides a context, and we just have to wrap our whole application in that context, and that's it. But we will learn how to use them today, right? Before any questions? No? Cool. So let's see what a context is in React. Okay? Now, so far, how many types of data a component can get? I would say two. One is the properties, right? So the properties in the component, let's say I have a function or a component for salutation. And I need to pass the name. And I'm returning hello, whatever name, right? So this is a property. So this is one of the ways that components can get access to data, can get some data. You can pass it as a property. That means that when we are using this salutation component, we need to do this, salutation, and we have to pass the name, right? So in this case, this component will get data from the attributes, from the properties. So it will show something like hello Jean in the page as an H1 tag. Now, this is one of the ways we can get data. The other way is by using state. Remember the use state hook? We had it, for example, in the traffic light component that we had, right? We have function traffic light. This function didn't have properties, but it has a state called color. And we have an initial color, let's say red. And then we use that color to render the traffic light, right? So this is the second way components can get data, using state. So there is only two ways for now. You get data from properties or you get data as a state, right? Only two ways. Now, today we're going to learn a new way. And that way is by using a context. So context is data that doesn't pass as property, that doesn't pass as state. It's basically data that we can access inside a component that comes from the parents. And it doesn't have to be the immediate parent. It could be any parent up in the hierarchy, as long as that component is providing a context with the data. So let's see how that works. First of all, this is two elements here. First, we need to create a context. And contexts are like classes, are like components, right? So if we want to create a context, for example, let's say we want to create a context where we are going to store the name of the user that's using our application, right? So let's say is user name context. Create context. Like this. this create function, this create context function comes from React. So we need to import it, of course. We need to do import create context from React. Okay? So we create the context, and this is just like a component, a regular component. Notice that the name is a Pascal case name, so it's capitalized. It's same as a component. Now, we can create this in a different module, and then when we want to use the context, we have to wrap it. So our whole application has to be wrapped in that context. So we do it like this: user name context dot provider, and we can pass a value. Okay, so notice that I use the context exactly as a component. It's actually a component. And it has a single property called value, right? And the value of this context is John Doe. Now, the value of the context can be anything. It could be a string, it could be an object, it could be functions, it could be anything. Anything that can be stored in JavaScript in a variable, you can put as the value in a context. Okay? So anything can be the value, any type of value. Now, inside, I can have any component. Let's say I'm using a salutation, right? And notice that I'm not passing any. Notice that I'm not passing any properties to salutation. Salutation will get the name of the user to provide that salute via the context, right? And it will only work because salutation is inside the context. If you put salutation outside of the context, I don't know what that is. Okay, here. If I put it outside, it will not work, right? It has to be inside the context to work. So this one has to be inside of the context. Now, that function, or that component, sorry, can be written like this: salutation. Of course, it doesn't take any properties. And the way to get the data is by saying, okay, use context. What is the name of the context that I want to use? Use user name context. And here, name will be whatever value I'm getting here, right? And now I can do return h1 hello name. And that's how we use a context. So we have two things. We have the context, well, actually three. We have the context itself, right? We have the whatever component we want to put the provider, and you usually put the provider on the topmost component, right? If you were using Next.js, for example, that would be the layout. So in the layout, you will put all the providers. You will put them there. So that means that anything in the page will have access to that, because remember, the layout encapsulates all the applications, all the pages. So you put the context at that level, that means that everything inside will have access to the context. And then you have components that essentially access the content and show the data, right? Now, this is nice and all, and we use it like not directly, but via other third-party libraries that implement this behavior for us. Like, for example, you see in React Query, we have something called a query client provider, right? With some properties. And then we have our application inside. Query client provider. So that means that anything that we put here can use the anything that we put inside can use the useQuery hook, right? And if you see, this is the same concept. It's just a context providing some data, some behavior, and then the hook. That this hook is just using useContext inside, right? And this query can provider is using the whatever provider they created, and they just encapsulated that, right? So we don't see it directly, but behind the curtain they are just using context, right? As I say, it's not uncommon, but it's really not very frequently that we have to create our own context, right? We usually don't. Questions before we move to? So the issue with this is that unless you're using a third party, like React Query, creating your own context has too many elements, right? You have to create the context or create a component, the context component. You have to wrap your whole application in that context, and then you have to use the context hook, right? So too many elements. And if you put this outside of the provider, then it doesn't have any data because it doesn't have a provider. So it's kind of problematic, right? So yeah, it's good and all, but we don't, as I say, we don't often use it, and we prefer some other type of state management. And for that, we're going to use Zustand. Now, Zustand is just one of many. I'm not saying that we should use this in every project, but at least I know that it's some library. It's a library that a lot of companies are using, and it's very simple to understand. It's very simple to use. So one of the purpose of today's class is to convert our to-do list application from all the logic, because if you remember our to-do list, all the logic of the to-do, like adding a task, removing a task, and adding, removing, I think, and listing, right, is all somehow combined with the code that renders the component, right? So it's inside the component. All that logic is inside the component, and we can avoid that. So with Zustand, we can create a custom hook, right? And that custom hook have two things. One is data, or something like a store, and actions. And these are just functions. Remember the concept of flux, right? So Zustand provides these two elements, the data store and the actions. So you are taking all that from the component itself and just putting it in a custom hook, and we will see how that works. And it's super easy to understand, to use. So let's see how a Zustand hook works. So when we create a custom, we have to create a custom hook. By the way, a custom hook means a hook that we create ourselves, not the ones that come with React, right? We're creating our own hooks. So for example, if we want to create a hook for the to-do list, I can name it use to-do list, right? Because it's my custom hook. Now, Zustand comes with a function called create. And if we just check the documentation, you see, this is the import. So the first thing that we need is to import the function create from Zustand. Of course, we need to install it first, right? npm install Zustand in our projects. You get the idea. Now, this function takes one parameter, and that parameter is a function that has two properties, but I will only use the first one, set. And this function has to return an object, right? Now, when you're returning an object, Let me explain. When you have an arrow function, right? And this arrow function is returning just the value, right? Like an inline value. That means that I have to put the code and say return. If I just want to return the value like a plus b here, that's fine. But what if I want to return an object? Remember, objects go around curly brackets. So if I put curly brackets here, the arrow function will think, oh, you are creating a piece of code, right? So how can we return an object inline directly without putting return? We have to put parentheses around it. And this indicates the arrow function that this is actually an object. Right? It's an object, and you see the properties, you can say C is A plus B. Right? So what I'm saying is, to return an object directly from an arrow function, you have to put parentheses around it. Otherwise, if you put it like this, this will be a syntax error, because this is not a valid JavaScript instruction, right? That's not Java. It's not correct. So to make it work, you have to put parentheses around. Okay. Now going back to this function, right? Create. Remember, create is a function. It takes one parameter. That parameter is a function that returns an object with all the elements from the store and the functions, right? So it's an object, so I will put just this. And I know that I will put the properties here. Now, we can also do this. We can also put curly brackets and then set return and return the object here. But as you can see, this is a lot of code that is unnecessary, right? We don't need to do that. We can just say parentheses, parentheses. And I know that this is an object. Okay? Now, what are we going to put in this object? All the keys in these objects, remember, an object has keys and values, right? Key, value, key, value. All the keys, if the value is not a function, this then is part of the store, right? So for example, here we have to-dos, and we can say, okay, it's an empty array. So that's the data. That's the data part. We can also have, for example, task, empty array, empty string. So my use to-do list will have a to-dos array and a task string. And that's the data that I will show in my to-do list, right? That's the data that I need for my to-do list. Okay. Now, these are the data. The other thing that I need, remember, is the functions, right? And the functions, what are the functions that I can perform over this to-do list? First one is change task. Remember when we changed the task in the input? Now, change task is a function that I would say new task, and I will do something. And this something is essentially changing the data, right? Now, for that, for changing the data, we have this set. Set is a function, again, and we can do set task is new task, and that's it. That's my change function. So that means that when I call this change task, I need to pass What's the new task? And this is what the one that we use when we're typing in the input. Remember, we always say we had it. I mean, I don't have the code here, but we had like set task, right? That set task now is called change task. Actually, we can call it set task the same way. So it's kind of easier to understand, right? So set task with the new task, and we use the set function. Now the set function, it takes an object, and whatever that object has, it will override the object that I have, right? So for example, task, with a new task, this will be override with the value of new task. So if I call this hook, so let's say I call it, I'm using the hook, my to-do list, and I say use to-do list, right? And in some way I do to-do list dot set task John, or sorry, walk the dog. Then if I do to-do list dot task, it will be walk the dog, right? And as you can see, everything is encapsulated in that hook, right? All the logic is in the hook. It's not in the component. Sorry. Okay, so what was the other one? The other one was add task, right? So add task. Now for add task, I don't need to specify what is the task, because the task I already have it here, so I don't need to pass any parameter, right? I'm just calling add task. Whatever it is in the task, that's what's going to get added to the to-dos. So in this case, we will do this. Set. And now, in this version, we need to know what is the previous state, right? Because we need to have access to the previous list of to-dos, so we can add one more element, and we need to have access to the task, so we can use it to add the new to-do, right? So there is a version of set. Remember, this set is the same as a state. Remember, when we use a state, we have two versions of use a state. We have the version that is just the object or the data, and it changes that. And there is a version with the function where it gives you the previous state, and whatever you return, that's the new state, right? So we're going to use this one here. And we're going to say, well, task will be empty, because we are clearing the task. And the to-dos will be all the previous to-dos and the previous task. And that's the function. Let me separate this a little bit so it's easier to understand. And I know it's kind of hard to understand right now. Yeah, here. Okay, so we have set. This is the function that we call it, right? Every time we want to modify the state of or the store, we need to call set. If we call set with just a new value, it will override that value, right? In this case, it's just changing task. In this case, because I need to access the previous state, I use this version of the set, and this version is an arrow function with the previous state, and then what I'm returning is what the modification is, right? So the modification is, well, task now will be empty because I don't need a task anymore. The one task will go to the to-dos, and to-dos will be all the previous to-dos and the previous task at the end, right? So that will be my set, and with that, every time I do add task, so right here, if I do to-do list dot add task, this will add the task, the current task, whatever that task is, right? I'm not checking if it's empty, is it the stream, I don't know, I'm not doing any of that, but you get the idea, right? And the last action or function that I need to implement is which one? Which one? Delete. So delete task or delete, task. For delete, we need to pass what?
The ID.
Well, in the version with the backend, yes, but in the version, the simple version, it's just the index. We implemented the first version, then we can make the asynchronous version with the backend. In the first version, we just needed the index. Which element of the to-do list we are deleting? So it's say index. And what are we doing when we have the index? We're calling set, and we're saying, okay, I need the previous data, and now to-dos will be the previous to-dos filter index is not I. Okay, and that's the delete. Okay, so in this hook with Zustand, I encapsulated all the behavior, of my first version of that to-do list, right? Notice that I have the data, to-dos, task, and I have the 3 actions that I can call. I'm following the same model that we have here, right? We have data, and we have actions in the form of functions. So every time we want to modify, notice that I cannot, once I have the hook, I cannot do this. Task equals buy groceries. That doesn't work. The only way to modify the task is to call the function setTask. So call the action with the new data, and that will modify. So this will simplify the logic, because all the logic is in a single file, in a single hook, and then my component doesn't need to know how this to-do list works. It only needs to render and connect the functions, right? And that's why we use this type of hooks. Questions? It's a lot. I know it's a lot, but so let's see how can we make this work in a component. So let's see if we can use code sandbox. Any of this will work. Okay. Oh, we need to Zustand. Okay. Oh, that's nice. I can install it just with a. Okay, so let's create a new file here and call it use to do list. Right? And this is the code that we have for your use to do list. So you see here, oh, export. Okay, so we have to-dos, tasks, this is the store, the data, and then we have set task, add task, and delete task. These are the actions. That means that the only way I can modify these two is via the actions. I have to call an action to be able to modify. That's the only way, right? And you can see here, this is the same concept of Flux. It shows that it's kind of like simplified to a single file. I don't have to, like it's an implementation of that concept. So I have store and I have actions. Okay? Now, how can we use this in a component? Let's build a to-do list. New file, to-do list. Right? And we need a to-do list. We need to use our hook, use to-do list. And here we had, well, we have a return. So it was an input, right? Now, what is the value of the input? Oh, let's put a div first. So what is the value of the input? The one that I have in the store, right? So it's to-do list. The store is to-do list dot task. On change. And this one is to-do list dot set task ev target dot value. Okay, so that's the input. Notice that I don't have any state, right, in my component. I only using that use to-do list. So all the behavior of the to-do list is encapsulated in that single hook. And that hook provides everything I need for that to-do list to work. Right now I have the input and the change of the input. Now let's make the list. ul to-do list dot to-dos dot map. Let's put a key here. Remember, every time you put a map, you have to put a key. I will use to do as the key as well. Okay. So now I'm listing all the to-dos from the to-dos property. Right? And how do I add one? Well, I need a handler here for the on key press or key down. On key down. Now I will have a handle enter here. It was key or code? Okay. Now, if it's enter, what do? I call the add task in the store. Add task, and that's it. That's all I need to do. And for delete, button X. Right? We can call on click. And here I do to-do list dot delete task. Oh, I need the index. Add that index. Something wrong here. So button on click to do list delete task. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Right. So that's it. So I connected all the logic and I'm calling all the actions in the right places, right? So now in my app, if I want to see that to-do list, and there is walk the dog. There you go. Buy groceries. If I delete it, delete it, right? So a single hook, custom made, has all the data and all the actions, and so everything is easier to understand, especially if you have a very complex logic, right? Because you can have multiple actions, and those actions modify the data in a different way, right? So that's why we create this type of hooks. Now, the other benefit of this is this hook, like the logic of the to-do list, can be implemented in different mediums, right? Right now I'm building for a web application using inputs and ULs and LIs, etc., right? But if I want to implement the same behavior on a mobile app, I only have to, this is already built. This is just JavaScript. So I can take this, use, for example, React Native, that allows me to create React application for mobile, and instead of using a to-do list that is built with HTML elements, I built a to-do list that is built with native mobile elements, right? Like views, buttons, etc. So I can build this the same way in a mobile app, but reusing the logic. So the logic is the same. Make sense? So that's what we used Zustand. Now there is a lot of other things that Zustand provides out of the box. The one that I prefer the most is this, the persist middleware. So persist is a middleware that allow me to have the state saved locally, right? So if I import persist here, let me see how can we do this. Oh no, this is migration. Wait. Wait, what is the middleware for persist? Persist. So persist. Persist. So create is a function and persist is another function. Okay. So I guess we need to do here. I call persist first function. So this one matches that one. Over here, comma. Wait. Give me 1 second. I need to find the GitHub documentation. It's a little bit better. Persist. Okay, so the second part is this. So this is to do list, and I'm missing something. Oh, create JSON storage. Okay, so now I created a version of this. You see, same use to do list, but this version is persisted locally. That means that when I say walk the dog and buy groceries and paint the fence, right? If I refresh this page, I will see the same. right? Because it's local. See, the state stays in the browser. That doesn't mean that I have a user or a backend or anything. It's just that in the browser, too bad we cannot see. That doesn't work for. That means that in the browser, we can check the data for this, and you see here that session. This is my to-do list, right? So what the state is, all my to-dos are over there. So it's locally stored in the session storage. That means the session storage, remember, is the one that as soon as you close the window, it deletes itself, right? But at least I had that. That means that the user can, load the data, refresh, and open the page again, and this data will be there. You see? Cool. So that's Zustand. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that you need to use it for every application that we build, because that might be an overkill for the type of application that we build usually, especially in the final project. But if you have something, for example, you're making a game, right? A game has a lot of logic and a lot of, who's playing now, and then what is the action that you're doing. So all that logic, you can implement it in a Zustand store with all the data and all the actions, and then you can build your board and just connect the elements on the board, right? So that's what we use Zustand for. Let's go to the next topic of today. And the next topic of today is React Form. And this will be the last. So what we want to build later is the same to-do list, and you can use this one as the starting point. I will share it with you, by the way. I'll put it on the Slack channel. But what we want to build later is the same store, but connected to the backend, right? So the same way we have functions here to set tasks, add tasks, delete tasks, we can have one for load tasks, right? And if you remember load tasks from the first iteration that we built with the backend, we have a load task that was a asynchronous function. So here you can have also asynchronous functions that loads the data and then sets to-dos, right? And from our component, we only have to do load data, and all the data will be loaded, right? You can use an effect, you can use whatever you want. So later, the purpose of today's class will be to convert the to-do list that we have with all the things integrated in the component, create a single hook using Zustand that has all the integrations and all the API calls, and then from our to-do to-do list component, just use that store, okay? Now, one other thing from Zustand that is kind of neat is that stores, if you create it like this, that the one we created now, they are singletons. And this is the word, by the way, singleton. Any ideas what singleton means? There's only one in the whole application, right? And this is nice because now that means that you can build, right? Before we had a to-do list component, that was basically everything inside, but now we can have a to-do list component that has a to-do, let's say a to-do list input, right? And this is just the input. And we can build another one that is a to-do list list. Or list items, sorry. Items. And this is the one that gets the items and lists them, right? Because they can access, when they access that hook, when they access this hook, what is the hook? When they access this hook, it's the same data. It's a singleton, so it's the only one in memory. That means that from any component that I'm using use to-do list, I'm accessing the same to-do list, right? There are ways to avoid that, but by default, when you create a hook, you're creating a singleton. Cool. Well, that's all. And questions? Now, I think this is fresher, so let's stop this here. And what happened? Stop streaming. Oh.